Women don't talk about money the way we should. Not honestly, not openly, and not with each other. But that's changing. I'm Syama Bunten, founder of Wealth Catalyst. And Getting Rich Together is where the conversation lives. Every week, a different woman, a different path, and a conversation that will change how you think about your own financial power. This community is growing and you belong in it. Please subscribe so you never miss an episode and leave us a 5-star review so more women can find their way here. Now, let's get rich together. I am so happy to have you today, Grace, over for this fantastic conversation. I remember the first time I had you over for tea and I sat down and I was like, this woman is incredible. She is so well networked, has built so many incredible things within your life. And I'm so excited to have everyone today get to know you a little bit better. Those of you tuning in, Grace Belangia is someone who has spent her entire better part of the last decade, not just supporting entrepreneurs, but quietly shaping the ecosystems around them. Moving capital, building communities, creating real pathways for founders to succeed. Grace, you are one of those rare people who understands how money, relationships, and opportunity comes together, and you're able to create these experiences and facilitate relationships, I think, in ways that very few do. So I'm so excited today to get to know the woman behind the fabulous LinkedIn profile, the woman who I got a chance to hang out with over tea. Grace, welcome to Getting Rich Together. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be with you and to share the story. And I hope, somebody out there will hear it and it'll resonate with them. So I in turn appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about, how has money flowed in and out of my life and, the kind of the journey that I've been on. So thank you for doing the podcast. I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, you got it. So Grace, before you were a total badass and, running things, maybe you were a 7-year-old who was a total badass running things, but I'm going to ask you anyways. Grace, take me back to life as a little girl. Where did you grow up in this beautiful world of ours? What was life like around you? Take me back to someone who was, 10, 12 years old. What was money like? What was life like?
Well, I think like you said earlier, everyone's got a different story, a different journey around this. So the first 18 years, I was born in Los Angeles, born in LA. My mother had come from South America in the early 60s and had immigrated here. She met my dad, who was a couple years older than her, in Hollywood. And they started a family. I was born in LA and then my parents moved to San Jose, California, lived there for a while. And then my dad was originally from Chicago. So we followed him to Chicago. And my mom immediately was like, this place is cold, and the marriage kind of did its own thing. And my parents got divorced. And then my mom moved us back to California. And I was able to settle down in Palo Alto, sort of the pre-Palo Alto of Silicon Valley and all of the tech stuff. And so I think that for most of my childhood, money was scarce. It wasn't something that was abundant, single mom, immigrant, pretty frugal in things, but really solid, focused on education. I have an older brother, Paul, and it wasn't something that we had a lot of. So, very creative and vacations and home decorating and things like that. But education was really important to her. And subsequently, I was able to go to UCLA. And I got my degree in political science. And then I moved home, thought I was going to be a lawyer. Didn't work out. Secretly, thank God for that. And then I ended up getting a master's degree in communications. And that sort of planted the seed in some of my, what I would say, community building. And if you were to ask 7-year-old Grace, I don't know that she would understand sort of what that meant, but I'll never forget 11-year-old Grace living in Palo Alto and going around the neighborhood and trying to find people that wanted to have a roller skating party together. And that was my first inclination of like community building, because we lived on a cul-de-sac. So I was like, who wants to roller skate together, like as a party? And so I organized a roller skating party in my mom's garage. And my mom will tell that story a lot too. Like that was my first like organizing gig.
And when you were in high school, what kind of student were you, Grace? Were you like, in the books? Were you like, I don't need this thing? Like, how did you sort of navigate, young Grace in high school?
I think in high school, I was definitely a nerd. Like I wasn't intellectually a nerd. I was just more like socially a nerd. I think I was a little bit of a introvert. Palo Alto. I mean, I went to school with a lot of Stanford professors' kids. And so I didn't have that sort of community on a day-to-day basis. I just knew of it. Again, we didn't have a lot of money, so I wasn't involved in, a lot of sports or theater. We didn't travel a lot. I was involved in student government, again, sort of a seed planted in terms of like, okay, how do I make the school a better place? And what I really enjoyed was Palo Alto, to its benefit, was a very community active city. And so I, as a very young person, got involved with a lot of volunteering, the community events, the libraries, the parks, the recreation department. I did a lot of those things. They were usually at low or no cost, because Palo Alto had a reputation of just being very active, in that space. And that was actually, the irony was, it was actually my first job out of college, was working for the city of Palo Alto. And so I organized their Easter egg hunts and their black and white balls and their runs. I was on a committee of event planners. Surprise,
Oh my
surprise.
gosh. I love that you've been organizing people your entire life. That's really that's a really powerful through line. So clear, Grace.
It didn't seem obvious. It didn't seem obvious.
And it sounds like she throws the best parties.
Yeah. It's funny because I learned really quickly that the intersection of experiences that I really wanted to help elevate had something that had to do along the lines of not activism per se, but very community engaged. So, whether it was a nonprofit or a foundation, or whether it was a gala or a fundraiser, there was something sort of intellectually interesting. And I was very curious about that work. And so I worked in tourism, I worked in hospitality, I worked in journalism. So a lot of it was sort of the intersection of not just entertainment, but really like educational entertainment, so to speak.
Yeah, of course. And so while you were, doing your university studies, were you all, did it start to become really clear to you then that like this was the line of work you wanted to go into? Like, what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
I think at first I thought it was kind of the PR, marketing, communications. I mean, definitely I like to talk to people. I like to plan things. It seemed like I was a decent writer, but every time I sort of entered into the arena professionally, it didn't quite stick. Like I was a good writer, but I wasn't a great writer. I was a good event planner, but I didn't want to be just a professional event planner. As a political science major, a lot of my friends went to law school. Like they went into government or politics or law. And I only looked at government from like, again, sort of a civic space, like civic mindedness of like, what is my role as honestly, as a citizen of the community? So I was very much interested in sort of local government information. I think I didn't know what I didn't know. Again, I didn't have the kind of parents that were really active. It was, pre-internet. I mean, I am of a certain age where you just were like, you didn't have all that access like LinkedIn and whatnot. And I mean, like I had an internship at the public radio station one year, study abroad one summer. I think if I didn't know what I didn't know, I think I would have joined the Foreign Service. If I had the means, I think I would have moved to DC. I think I would have gotten really involved just on, again, sort of as a civil servant, as like, okay, how do I help, save democracy, improve communities? And, long story short, I mean, I ended up getting married to a Navy officer because I kind of thought I was going to see the world from an aviation standpoint. And that was sort of a little way into that world. I didn't think of ever joining the service per se in the military, but the diplomacy, the embassies, that sort of international part, I think I got that from my mom. Just how do you help those that, may not have come here or been born here? I mean, I was a first generation college graduate and really felt called to sort of give back at that age and stage.
That's incredible. As you were starting to build your career, obviously anyone who graduates college at any time, they realize you don't just get, when you graduate college, you don't get paid very well. It really doesn't matter what you do. I mean, unless you do the law route and you spend, many more years in school, but, starting to sort of think about building your young life, post university education and starting to think about those early inflection points. Did you find yourself of the mindset of, oh my gosh, I need to get a job. I need to start paying rent. I need to start savings. How did you sort of reconcile, the early needs to make money, which are so real, even more now today, but always real. No one ever graduates and goes, this is the best time to graduate.
Yeah.
Oh my God, how do I get a job? So how did you kind of reconcile needing to get work, how you started to think about, your financial life as a young person? Where did you spend your money?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I thought of it as very fortunate at the time because when I graduated from college, I didn't get a job right away, but I knew that I, had gone to UCLA and then my mom was still in Northern California. And so I moved home after college just because I was like, okay, let me just be in the Bay Area and see what happened. And it was again, kind of the dawn of the internet. It wasn't kind of exciting or sexy to work for like a tech company. It was just kind of like, oh, you're selling widgets or you're selling computer screens and things like that. So I was like, I don't know that I necessarily want to do that. And I think that I give my master's degree the lens in which I was like, oh, I can be involved maybe on the back of the house for like a company. So, whether it was in San Francisco. So I ended up working for like a private equity firm and I got to see firsthand how the investment world worked. And I worked in the research department, and I'll never forget, again, my own kind of young, naive brain that I would come into work and everybody would be already at their desks on their computers doing, what they need to do. And I remember thinking like, wow, these are early birds. And they were working New York hours, because of the stock market. So they were coming in at, 5:00 in the morning and they were working 5 to 3. And I just kind of walk in at, 8 a.m. and whatnot. But it afforded me a lens into the finance world and the investment world and what it was like to find companies that were starting out, that were looking for investment dollars. And then because I was in the research side, I wasn't on the banking or the finance side. So a lot of it was just data, and I don't know. I think that was my first inclination into being like, oh, I don't want to be a stockbroker, but I like the research. I like the people aspect of what these companies were looking like and what were they doing and who was investing in them. And kind of to your point earlier, I mean, there were definitely some people who were like, I want to make a lot of money. And then there was me that was like, oh, money's nice, but what I really want to do is make a lot of impact. And so there was that constant sort of, it's not friction. I think of it more as opportunity. It's like, okay, how do you do both? How do you improve the world? And there were like, telecommunication companies, there were healthcare companies, there were education companies. And so you can sort of see when you were doing the research syllabus, the problem that they were trying to solve. And I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. And then I was like, oh, there's a lot of money in that.
Wow. That is so interesting. How old were you when you had that experience?
That was 20, 23, 24, 25.
I mean, that's such a interesting experience to have at such a formative age where you can kind of see systems, and sort of get a peek behind like what is moving, how is value creation happening, what are the key indicators to look at, as you're sort of starting to think about what this looks like. And, I imagine at 23, 24, 25, you're not writing like big investment checks, but you're certainly learning how to think like someone who is an investor and who's starting to think about what opportunities look like. You've also, had a number of experiences as being an owner, like a business owner, and sort of being on the founder side of things. Did you have at that age, as you were starting to understand what this, entrepreneurial ecosystem looks like, did you have it inside of you that was like, I'm going to be a serial founder and like build a lot of companies? Or was the inclination more, let me go down a more traditional career path and sort of start to build some stability? How did you kind of reconcile these early inklings, I guess, as to like what was going to come later down the road?
I think it's a little complicated because at the time, what I came to realize, and I give credit to my mom, is that, when you like saving and investing are two different sides of a coin. So, to have a little bit of money and to save it and not spend it is one thing. And to have a little bit of money and save it and invest it, you have this, revenue stream potentially. You have this foundation of savings and it's compounded interest. So, whether it's real estate or your business or your education, I think I got that from my mom because she, like she was adamant about like, as soon as she could buy the house, pay the education. The other things were a little more frivolous, like travel and clothes and braces and whatnot. But instilling the what was important to where you put your money and where you keep your money to save. And then watching the investment firm, because you started hearing about exits and things like that, and how, you put $1,000 in and then 5 years later it's 10,000. You're like, wow, how did that happen? And it wasn't the physical work, it was the business of the work. And so I started understanding the difference, in different sectors about like how your money makes you money. Like there's only so many hours in the day, right? And so, certain professions obviously lend itself to that. But what honestly really, really happened was I got married. I got married. My husband was in the Navy. The Navy at the time had been downsizing some of their bases around the Bay Area. I don't know if you were here or there, but Presidio closed. It was an Army base. The Alameda closed and Moffett Field closed, and he was stationed at Moffett. And so it was a little bit of a, our first year of marriage. It was like, okay, well, now what do we do? Like, you were a Navy pilot, and you're getting out of the Navy. And so he ended up joining his family business, and I followed him. And so that was a little bit of an off ramp for my career because I went from California to Georgia. And so it was different, full stop. It was just different. And I did that when I was 26.
What was it like to join someone else's family business and to also, move states? I feel like it's one thing if you are born into a family business and there's some sort of expectation of, and now you have to, take this on, but then to also, have all the eggs in the basket, like, all right, we're all gonna, put our time and energy into this. What was that like for you?
I mean, at the time I was young and I was in love and I was like, yeah, sure. Of course. Let's go try this. It wasn't something that I thought was like a big, I didn't think it was going to be as big as it ended up being, which is in a good way. I mean, in terms of, our lifestyle and whatnot, but it was hard. I mean, I didn't understand a little bit about sort of the gaps in what I was experiencing, lifestyle wise. I mean, I was a California native and I moved to Georgia. And I sometimes equate it to a little bit of like when my mother moved from South America to America, to North America. It's like, oh, it's a little bit different, food, religion, people, whatnot. But, I ended up working in hospitality while my husband was in the family business. And so it was an easy lifestyle at the time. I mean, I fully admit in terms of like knowing that my career path had sort of leaned out a little bit. I mean, we started a family, I had 2 kids. And so I basically, to your point earlier about entrepreneurship, I basically started working for myself once my kids were born. And it afforded me the flexibility to do that. At the time, there wasn't a work from home option. There wasn't the same kind of Silicon Valley innovation energy in the Southeast to say, okay, as a young mom, how would I balance that professionally? So I did I tell people I had like four part-time jobs at the time, but I was my own boss. So it was flexible, right? I was a professor at the local university. I was a travel writer. I started a online magazine with a few partners. I was a convener. I did, marketing and events for people as an independent consultant. It was the dawn of the website. So I help people design websites,
Yeah.
People are like, why do I need to be on the internet? And I'm like, that's a good question. Nobody ever buys anything on the internet. I mean, yeah, back in the day.
Famous last words, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's really funny. And so as you guys were sort of building family and you started to build these like, interesting experiences and starting to kind of build out this portfolio, right?
Yeah.
Like for
Yeah.
early on, like quote unquote portfolio life, how did you sort of think about, or when did you sort of think about, okay, now, you had this background understanding investing, you're now building this life together, having a family, at what inflection points did you start to think about, or maybe even not even think, but exercise your money a little differently,
Yeah. Yeah.
when did things start to land for you, and how did you start to take initial steps?
Well, I think at the time, there was I was afforded, again, sort of the time and energy and space to, again, provide for my family and then be myself professionally. And there was probably, when I look back on it now, there was probably a little bit of, I wouldn't say like anxiety, but there's a little bit of a like, now what? It was a little bit of like, all right, the family, the dog, the house, the school, the community. And it was then that I was introduced to my current organization. Like we started our organization in 2012. And it was based on this idea that like, oh, can where I live seed a community that would mimic a sliver of what happens in the Bay Area when it comes to startups and entrepreneurs and innovation? Because we didn't have the tech community, but we had a medical community, we had a military community, we had a energy community. And so the intersection of intellectual capital in Augusta was paralleling what I thought could create an ecosystem around entrepreneurship. And I was able to kind of come in with my community building, and I could come in with a little bit of, angel investing, and I could come in a little bit with my network and be like, okay, how can I help seed a city that has been under-resourced to spawn an innovation economy, to spawn a startup community, to invest not just capital, but social and intellectual energy around somebody that wants to start a business. Because those were the seeds that Silicon Valley planted. It's why everybody's like, oh, you have to come here to start a business. And I'm like, do you really? Like, is this the only place? No, it's not. And so what does it look like for other cities to want to sort of do that? And I was in a position to do that. My kids were, I tell people sometimes, I'm like, look, my daughter turned 16. She had the family car. She had the debit card, and she had the world's oldest, worst telephone. So she had a degree, and this is like pre-social media, right? So she had some agency. And I was like, all right, I'm still a mom, but like I can double down into this work. I didn't have to be in the carpool line as much. I knew she could come home and, dinner would be there, and I didn't have to make it. And so there's a little bit of, I'm sure a lot of us women have, the challenges of motherhood and career and what does that look like? And so it allowed me to sort of double down into this movement in 2012, 2013.
That's powerful. And had you been angel investing before that, or had you been advising startups, or was this sort of the first, like, okay, I'm jumping in and like, going after it? Like, how much exposure and personal, exposure had you sort of put into the space?
I mean, I had invested in some stocks, I had been watching some companies. I hadn't done any personal investing because I knew enough to know that I didn't know enough. And when I started the organization, I mean, it was all sweat equity. Like we started this nonprofit. We got some community people to join us. And this is, again, you have to remember, right after the 2008 recession, a lot of people were unemployed. Again, it was kind of the movement towards the Internet of Things, IoT. And so we rode the maker movement. So if you remember, like people were making things. So there was like maker fairs, there was Make Magazine. So it was all about like, how do you make something with technology and coding and infrastructure? And I'll never forget, going to my first meetup, because meetup was very like, oh, meetups, those are fun. And it was all these technologists, and it was all these coders and programmers. And there were some entrepreneurs and funders. And I remember being a fly on the wall, being like, okay, this reminds me of the Bay Area. Like this meetup attracted a sliver of that community. And that's where I felt like, oh, these are my people. Like I want to be a part. I want to grow this. I want to be a part of it. And so I was one of the founding members of the organization, and I became the executive director. And I'll never forget the idea that like, okay, if I'm going to invest in these guys, I got to learn that. And I give credit to Pipeline Angels, because that was the group of women that were going around the country, and they were seeding these cohorts. and they were launching a cohort in Atlanta. And I was like, I'm in. And so I drove to Atlanta once a month for 6 months. And I went and, we met at a co-working space and we learned how to invest. And we we did a seed investment, and it was the typical, like, okay, here's your pitch, here's your deck, you do the due diligence.
What was your first deal like, Grace? Like, what did it feel like to write the check? And like, did you hold your breath? Were you like, yeah, like, what was it? What was it like when you did your first investment?
One of the things I talk about with people sometimes is when you could do two things. If you are a philanthropist and you donate money, your investment is into society. Your return on investment as a donor or philanthropist is society is a better. When you make an investment check to a startup or a founder, your ROI is also to improve society, because you may not get a return. You may not get that money back. And so I looked at it through kind of that lens as like, I'm writing this check. I may never see that money again, but I know that I'm helping this person create something that's really, really important, that's going to help the community, that's going to improve society. And I mean, these were bad. I mean, it was all women, because that's Pipeline Angels. So, these were badass women doing amazing things. And some of them were probably a little bit too so one of the things I know in this space, now that I've been doing this for a dozen years, is you have what's called more like hobbyists. Like, somebody's like, I got a great idea. It's a terrible business model. It's a great hobby, and then you have others that don't have the wherewithal around business. And so it's like, keep your day job. You don't have the financial literacy to keep up with it. And then some just, again, don't understand the mechanisms that it takes. And I put myself in that basket. It's like, I didn't know enough about how to start a business, build a business, scale a business, sell a business. And so my cohort were doing the due diligence around the financials, the math. I was doing more of the interviews around the team. And it was very exciting. It was very exciting. I mean, it's wonderful to feel like you can make a small dent in somebody's lives in that space. And it did align with my values. It did align with what I could afford to do at the time. So it was very gratifying. And I was like, oh, if I make some money out of this.
A few years ago, I called 50 of my closest friends and asked them one question: how do you manage your own money? 95% of them wouldn't answer. It's the reason I built the Money Story Reset. 5 reflections on the beliefs shaping your relationship with money, and my own stories are in every single one. The parts I don't usually say out loud included. I didn't write this from the outside. I did every page myself first. It's free. The link is in the show notes, or go straight to wealthcatalyst.com/reset. That's wealthcatalyst.com/reset.
So great. What did your daughter think? How much did you share with her about like what you were embarking on and building? Was she like, oh my gosh, my mom's a superhero? Or was she like, Mom, what are you doing?
I have to ask her. I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think she knows how important I thought that, women empowerment, I think, being in control of your agency, of your finances, education was really important. I mean, she ended up going to Georgia Tech. She graduated in 4 years, and then she went off to San Francisco. And so she's been here, for 6 or 7 years. So she understood sort of the grit around what it takes to be successful. And, I give credit to her dad too, kind of building that up and understanding, where does money come from? What do you do with the money? How is it acquired? How do you deploy it? So she has a really good sense of that, I think, which I'm very proud of her for.
I love that. As you are sort of thinking about, starting to angel invest and then becoming a limited partner and starting to join funds and really, stepping more fully into these private markets, how did you decide to sort of make the jump from angel to LP? I think angel investing is so fun and it's exciting and you get this like raw thing, but then there's like, I don't know, there is something nice when a fund manager is responsible for doing all the diligence. So how did you sort of decide to make that jump?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, again, sort of the compounded interest of early investments, afforded me to sort of be in a space where I could make bigger investments and investments more often. And I learned a lot, again, with my organization, understanding the ebb and flow. I mean, the thesis that you could start a company in the Southeast is true. The idea that if you want to start a big company and you need more money and you need more access, there are definitely some communities where that is not as viable. I mean, straight up, you don't have the banks, you don't have the investors, you don't have what I call the ecosystem. And so learning around what that looked like afforded me a investment thesis where I was in a position to say, like, okay, now that I have access to some funding, who do I want to invest in, and where do I want to invest in, and what do I want to invest in? And, there's some humble pie there to say, like, yeah, not all my investments worked out. I mean, there are definitely places where, you lose money and the business closes. There's some things now that, I'm going on, 8 years now, and there's no exit in sight. There's no IPO going on. So, it's kind of a long game, and you have to be okay with that. You have to learn, that, high risk, high reward. The numbers, like, it's exponential. I mean, everybody knows. You watch it, things on, TikTok and YouTube, and you're like, oh, I invested $10 and I made $1 million in a year. And you're like, really? Is that
you're like, please show me the way. Really?
Yeah.
How did you do that?
but the flip side is that you have a lot of risk. I mean, you have people that lost their savings, that, declared bankruptcy, that got into predatory, loan agreements. And that's equally unhealthy. And, and that's the part where, like, I'm not interested in extracting wealth at the expense of other things. And I think that not everybody's going to think that way, but if you align your mission and values to, like, yes, I want to make money and I want to invest and I want these investments to do the fill in the blank, that is possible. So most of my network now is around, it's around female funders, female founded, female products, whether it's like healthcare or wellness. A lot of it is, there are some funds that are specific to the Southeast, because I do think there are some under-resourced opportunities there. And you can't bridge the gap as much as you would like to between, San Francisco and Atlanta, because it's still apples and oranges. There's an investment community, but it's not on the same playing field. And so I like to help different communities do different things. I'm sort of industry agnostic. Like I sort of look at, the environment, obviously, healthcare, the Internet of Things. I don't like to invest in nefarious activities. I just don't, some of it's domestic, some of it's international. So what I've learned to do is trust the fund managers. So as an LP, there's still a fund that you invest in, and that they do the due diligence, they do the deal flow. I sit in the wings, in the monthly calls thinking, like, oh, that's really interesting, or, oh, that's not as interesting. Oh, let me think about it. So you have to have your own agency a little bit around that, because at the end of the day, it's still your money.
Sure. Yeah, of course. And, now that you've also, you've spent so much time entrenched in the space, and sort of in this startup ecosystem, and are such a, champion of the work and of innovation and sort of progress. From when you look at sort of your own personal pie and have you noticed, like, a shift more towards the private markets, or have you sort of grown all the parts of the pie equally? And by the pie, I mean, the S&P 500, or, thinking about real estate, have you sort of picked a lane, or have you found yourself sort of diversified or growing equally in these different areas?
That's a really good question. I would say that it's constantly changing. Like, I don't have just one thesis around it. At the end of the day, again, like, even with my day job, I don't have a pillar in which, like, I'm thinking, like, oh, I'm only investing in women. I'm like, yeah, women are, they have interesting companies, but I've invested in men before, or, like, again, Southeast, West Coast, geography, industry. I think the thesis is more like, okay, is this thing doing good in the world? That's the scaffolding around where my investment dollars are going. Am I investing with people whose values I am aligned with? That's the fund that I'm working with. Is there a component to it, to think that I'm going to get a return that's going to benefit society, that might benefit my children, that might benefit my me. Those are all things that are very, very interesting to me. So I'm constantly learning. One of the groups that I think we overlapped with for a minute was Women with Capital, and that was another group, that Barbara helped launch during COVID. And that also helped me understand, how women move money and what does that look like. And so it's been helping me, philanthropically as well as an investor to say, yeah, money is a tool. Like and I tell this to the entrepreneurs and the founders as well, and the nonprofits. I'm like, the money is there. Like, it's not lack of money, to your point earlier. It's like, what do you do with it? Like, how is that tool working and aligned with who you want to be and the outcomes that you want? Because you can't take it with you. And so what are you going to do while you're on this earth, to help and that's probably my thesis is like reserve and deploy. I'm not taking it with me. So how can I help improve the world while I'm here?
I love
that's my investment thesis.
Have you, in terms of sharing that philosophy with, family and, like I keep going back to, what does your daughter think? Like how are you sort of, bringing these conversations that you're having in the external world, around like allocation and values, does that conversation, has that made its way home? Is that something you guys talk about? What does it look like to sort of have that be more integrated?
Oh, I think, we haven't had too many conversations around it. I mean, she's just starting, her career. She just got married last year. My son, he's been out of college for a couple of years. He's still navigating. And I think it's kind of along the lines of stewardship. When you are a steward of a certain amount of money, you can deploy it, you can activate it. It's not necessarily aligned with like a lifestyle per se. I mean, we all, want to live and food and health and home and whatnot, but it's really around a mindset creating in terms of like, okay, now that you have this asset, what can you do with it? There's a continuous family conversation around that. Like, what kind of impact do you want it to make? And at the end of the day, you also could not do anything. It can sit and get some interest, and it can sit and it can be available, for the next generation. So there's actually lots of options around it, but I'm more curious around deploying it as opposed to having it sit around, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think that's really, really powerful. As you're sort of thinking about the work that you're so entrenched with now and building ecosystems and moving capital, I always think that, especially feels like every day, I feel like we are living longer and longer, and sort of as we think about legacy and this body of work, you've definitely had some incredible through lines in your life around coalescing people, using your capital and your time to create positive impact and change. But my darling, you're probably going to be alive for another, 50, 60 years. So like, I need you to tell me, like, what is this body of work going to look like when you look back on your life in, let's say, early 100s, maybe mid 100s, what is that legacy going to feel like for you?
That's a really good question. So I've actually thought about it a lot lately, and some of it just has to do, again, with sort of where I am in my life. I mean, my kids are grown, I'm working, I'm investing, I'm giving back to the community. And I think about the work that I do as this conduit to the community around, the economic world that we live in. And I use the term economic mobility around the idea that, like, okay, who may be a have not and want to be a have. And the activist in me talks about generational poverty and talks about like how people inherit poverty and can never kind of get out of that space. And then you have a bridge to generational wealth and the second and the third and the fourth generation. And how does that bridge exist? And what does that bridge do? And so I think of the work that I do. And I think if I'm going to look back on my life, I am going to build a really good bridge. I'm going to invest and donate and work and be the connective tissue to helping people that want to provide for themselves. And again, I do this through this lens of entrepreneurship and founders and funders. That's my lane. And what can I do to help that ecosystem exist and thrive? And I almost parallel it to the work of teachers and nurses, because I do think it gets I think the bridge is under resourced. I think the bridge doesn't have the same values that those that fund it want to see it done. And you see that in that kind of caregiving space. And so what does it look like to make sure that's a solid bridge that's well resourced? That would be the thing I'd be looking back on.
That's really powerful, Grace. That is beautiful. We've talked a lot about money, investing it, what it looks like to be thoughtful around deploying it, certainly a lot about your values. But the question I'd love to ask you is, what has been the most fabulous recent thing that you've spent your money on? Money is also for fun. We can do some great, fun, enjoyable things with it. So tell me, what has been your most recent fabulous way of spending your money, Grace?
I think it may sound silly. So the consistent thing that I have done that brings me a lot of joy, which is completely unrelated to anything that we've talked about the last 45 minutes, is when I moved 2 years ago, I moved into a house that did not have what I would call a beautiful curb appeal, landscape, garden. It was very generic, neutral, and I get that that's some of the style of just the world that we live in. And I went ahead and I full on invested in flowers and landscaping and gardens. And I'll send you some pictures later. And, I painted my front door. It was a gray, and I painted it like the French Greek blue, that kind of powerful blue color. And I wanted to have the happy colors around. And it took a whole year to get the flowers going. And I got a landscaper and a gardener, and I, went to Home Depot, and I found a bunch of, books and YouTube videos. And it had been something that I'd been craving for decades, because I couldn't have a garden when I was growing up because we couldn't afford it. I mean, that was kind of an expense. When I lived in the Southeast, we lived in a conservation community where there were no fences. And so the deer would just eat everything. And so you couldn't, no flowers. I mean, some things they don't eat, but for most of it they couldn't eat. And then I came here and I was like, I'm going to invest in flowers. I'm going to buy the flowers, buy the seeds, buy the bulbs, and then I'm going to do it again and again and again, and annuals and perennials. Anyways, so I tell you all that because the investment in that brings me such joy, and it's almost to the point where it's year round. There's something blooming, which was kind of my thesis. And what brings me even more joy is the people that walk by it, when they're walking their dogs in the evening, and they're like, "You have a beautiful garden." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you. It's my gift to you."
And all the bees and all the hummingbirds. Yeah. I mean, you are once again, Grace, even in how you spend your money to bring you joy, you are creating ecosystems.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And I think about it as this I'm creating my own cutting garden. So I don't, have to go to, I can be my own florist, so to speak. And so it touches all of those points, the creativity, the child within, the Martha Stewart in me, it's like this little space that I invest in. I mean, the return on investment, right? What does that look like? And I highly recommend it. I learned about this kind of thesis. There's an author. It's so funny that you asked me this question. I'm trying to think if I have any of her books here. Alexandra Stoddard. I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
No.
She is in her 80s. She's a beautiful, beautiful woman. I've met her a few times, and my mother bought me a book when I got married, and it was How to Live a Beautiful Life. And there was one chapter that I'll never forget. And it kind of, her big thing was flowers and candles and napkins and pillows. And my family gives me a hard time. And she said, when you go to the grocery store and you have to buy the eggs and the butter and the tomatoes and the toilet paper, you need to buy yourself a bouquet of flowers. And it's just a beautiful little nugget of something.
I love flowers so much.
Yeah.
It's such a joy in my heart. Grace, it's been such an incredible afternoon spending. I feel like we could chat so much longer. But before I let you go, you have been such a nurturer of ecosystems and people around you, a real visionary with what your spirit is sort of leading you towards. I want to know what you're calling in, and how can we support you in your endeavors? What do you need right now?
Well, thank you. Thank you. If I were to advance the movement of what I'm working on and help build this ecosystem and help sustain the ecosystem, I would invite the community to buy a brick. Buy a brick to build the bridge. Help me do that. Invest in the work that we do as an organization so that thing is available for founders, for entrepreneurs, for startups. The symbolism around what that looks like, I'm sure you can just visualize like what those needs are. They're never ending, and there's a lot of bridges that need to be built. But the one that I'm particularly building can make a difference, obviously, and make an impact. And I think that there's enough out there in the community that wants to join me on that journey. And if I could have that conversation and support for that would be amazing. So thank you.
It's wonderful, Grace. Thank you for being here today on Getting Rich Together. What a gift to have you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. This is the conversation we come back to every single week. Real women, real wealth, and what becomes possible when we stop being silent about money. If today's episode moved you, don't let it stop here. Wealth Catalyst is where women go to take it further. Our Freedom Tour salons are gathering women in 32 cities this year. Intimate evenings in homes and private spaces where women talk honestly about money, risk, and what they're building. And if you're ready to go even bigger, join us at the Wealth Catalyst Summit, a full-day event in San Francisco this October. Find your city and claim your seat at wealthcatalyst.com. We'll see you there.